Every single week, fantasy football comes down to the tiniest details, and sometimes it's the stats you don't know that cost you the win. These are 10 insane stats that could be the difference between winning your Week 6 matchup or getting completely crushed. And here's a stat you probably didn't know. We are almost at 100K subscribers this year, just about 11,000 more subscribers needed. Please help us get there by the end of the football season. Do us a favor, if you've watched our content, if you enjoy our content, and you haven't subscribed yet, take 1 second, hit that subscribe button. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, the first stat you need to know is J.K. Dobbins versus this Jets defense. Now, the Jets are allowing the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, but that's not the stat you need to know. I mean, anybody could look that up. That's an obvious stat. But let's look at J.K. Dobbins specifically, how he matches up versus this Jets run defense. Right now, 40% of J.K. Dobbins' rush attempts are zone rush attempts. And on those rush attempts, he has the second highest yards per carry in the NFL at 6.45 yards per carry, plus a very strong 54.8% success rate. Now let's look at the Jets versus zone and man rushes. Against zone rushes, they are allowing 4.39 yards per carry and a 48.1% success rate. But you look at them against man rushes, only a 3.83 yards per carry and a 27% success rate. This is a good schematic matchup for J.K. Dobbins, a guy who has been good anyways this season, even in tougher matchups. In fact, Rich Rebar of Twitter, a guy I follow, did a lot of research on this. Right now, J.K. Dobbins has a 41.6% success rate, which is 17th best out of all running backs that qualify. 18.2% of his runs go for 10 or more yards, 3rd best. Only 14.3% of his runs are stuffed, 12th best. 27.3% first down touchdown rate, 10th best. And he's faced a 50.6% stacked box rate, which is the 7th highest in the NFL. And he's still been very good, and I think this is a great matchup for J.K. Dobbins this week. I have J.K. Dobbins as a strong start in Week 6. All right, the next stat is Alvin Kamara, and specifically Alvin Kamara versus Kendre Miller and how this Saints backfield is going. So let's look at it, the last couple of weeks. Let's start with Week 4. You look at it. In Week 4, Alvin Kamara played 72% of the snaps, Kendre Miller 32%. They were very close in attempts, right? Alvin Kamara got 44% of the attempts, Kendre Miller 32%. Now Alvin Kamara is still the preferred pass catching back. Of course, he ran 48% of the routes, had an 18% target share. But now let's fast forward to last week. We see the snaps got a lot closer here, 53% to 41%. Kendre Miller actually had more carries, 33% to 26% as far as their rush attempts go. Now, yes, Alvin Kamara is still the preferred pass catching back here, ran 60% of the routes. Kendre Miller did run 28%, but look, 18% target share versus 3%. Kendre Miller is never going to be heavily involved as a pass catcher, but this is a big problem for Alvin Kamara if he's just going to be the pass catching back here. As we've seen the last 2 weeks, he's lost more and more carries to Kendre Miller. Not to mention, the Patriots are 4th toughest against running backs. They just held James Cook to his worst game of the season easily and only 3.3 yards per carry. I would have a really hard time. Honestly, I'd have a hard time starting either of these guys this week. This is not a good spot for them. But I know Kamara is probably the guy most of you have in fantasy or that maybe you're depending on. I mean, if you're in a PPR league, at least he catches passes and he can save you there. But man, don't expect a big Alvin Kamara week this week. Now, we did see a big Jamar Chase week last week, and I think we might see another big Jamar Chase week. And no, it's not because of Joe Flacco. I don't even know if Joe Flacco is going to be better than Jake Browning, honestly. But I actually really like this matchup for Jamar Chase, even though on paper you say, ooh, Packers, tough matchup. I think the way the cover shell they run is really good for Jamar Chase. You look at it right now, the Packers run the 6th most cover 3, 37.4% of the time. This year against cover 3, Jamar Chase's targets per route run goes from 0.23 to 0.38. That is a huge increase. Why does that matter? Well, according to Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points, who did a lot of research on this in the offseason to try to figure out, what coverage shells allow wide receivers to have those ceiling games, he said, in matchups against a defense that's played at least a 38% cover 3 rate, now they're just under that at like 37.4, but close enough. Players with at least a 5% better targets per route run versus cover 3 hit 20 plus fantasy points 17.2% of the time. That's approximately a 35% better ceiling rate than all players across all matchups. So even in this tough matchup, the way the Packers cover, I think is an advantage for Jamar Chase, as long as Joe Burrow isn't horrifically worse than Jake Browning, and I don't know if that's going to be the case. I think Jamar Chase could have another good game this week, maybe even another big game. Go ahead, keep him in your lineups in week 6. And I know Brian Thomas Jr. has not had that big game yet, but maybe, just maybe, week 6 is going to be it. First of all, going against the Seattle defense, they're an absolute pass funnel defense. You look right now, they are second toughest in terms of fantasy points against the running backs, but they are 4th worst in terms of fantasy points to wide receivers. Also, they play the 6th most cover 4, about 21.2% of the time. Now, I'm going to do another Ryan Heath quote here, and it's going to say 22% of the time, but again, they're just under this mark, only 0.8% under it. I think that's close enough. And when you look at Brian Thomas Jr. this year against cover 4, he's got a 0.38 targets per route run versus cover 4, only 0.22 versus all other coverages. Again, going to go back to Ryan Heath. He says, in matchups against a defense that's played at least a 22% cover 4 rate, players with at least a 5% better targets per route run versus cover 4 hit 20 plus fantasy points 21.1% of the time. That's approximately a 66 better ceiling rate than all players across all matchups. And let's not forget, Brenton Strange, now on IR, that could open up even more targets here for Brian Thomas Jr. I think we're going to see his best game of the season. I think he's going to have finally a big game this week. And I'll take it a step further here. Looking at his line on Underdog right now, 57.5 receiving yards. I'll take the higher with that. You pair that with this Cam Ward free pick. He just needs to get anything on Sunday. That's an easy win right there. Not to mention, when you deposit for the first time using promo code ENDGAME, Underdog is going to match your deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. And look, you take this pick'em, Cam Ward plus Brian Thomas Jr., you play just $5. Win or lose, Underdog is going to give you $100 in bonus cash. All right, for some reason, I've been labeled a DK Metcalf hater. Look, I don't hate DK Metcalf. I just hate the fact that he's on the Steelers in this terrible passing game, and I really do not feel good about DK Metcalf this week. The Browns right now run the most cover 1, 37.5% of the time they are in cover 1. You look at DK Metcalf this year, his yards per route run go from 2.99 versus all other coverages to 1 yard per route run versus cover 1. And I know he had that big 80-yard touchdown last week. And look, DK Metcalf is the type of player that can do that. So it's not like we can just say, oh, total fluke here. He can do that. But you take out that big play, he only had 4 catches for 46 yards the rest of the game. The 2 games prior to that, he'd only had 52 yards combined. Now, sure, he's scoring touchdowns, and that's what's keeping him afloat, and that's probably what's going to need to keep him afloat here against a tough Browns defense who plays a ton of cover 1. Look, I get it. You might need DK Metcalf in week 6. Just don't expect a repeat of what we saw in week 4 before the bye. Now, we could see a repeat of what we saw from Calvin Ridley last week because I love his matchup this week against the Raiders. The Raiders run the most cover 3 of any team. 52% of the time, basically, they are in cover 3. When we look at Calvin Ridley this year versus cover 3, his targets per out run goes from 0.22 versus all other coverages to 0.26 versus cover 3. And again, I'm going to go with what Ryan Heath says here. In matchups against a defense that's played at least a 38% cover 3 rate, players with at least a 5% better targets per route run versus cover 3 hit 20 plus fantasy points 17.2% of the time. That's approximately a 35% better ceiling rate. But it gets even better for Calvin Ridley this week because you look at the Raiders, okay, they're not like one of these teams where on the paper give up a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers, but they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers lined up out wide. Calvin Ridley this year has played 75% of his snaps out wide. This is a great spot for Calvin Ridley. I don't think last week was a fluke. Remember, this is a guy I was very high on this year. I think we could see another good performance from Calvin Ridley this week. If you need a flex, you could certainly do worse than Ridley in week 6. And honestly, one of my favorite wide receiver starts this week, a guy who's just kind of always solid, but I think could be better than solid this week, is Khalil Shakir of the Bills. Right now, the Falcons run the most single high of any defense, 68.5% of the time. When you look at Khalil Shakir, he has a 0.16 targets per route run versus all other coverages, 0.24 versus single high. And again, according to Ryan Heath's research, in matchups against a defense that's played at least a 63% single high rate, players with at least a 10% better targets per route run rate versus single high hit 20 plus fantasy points 17.1% of the time. That's approximately a 35% better ceiling rate than all players across all matchups. I think this is a very good spot, potentially a blow-up spot for Khalil Shakir this week. If you got him, you should feel good starting him. But look, if you don't feel necessarily good about your lineup and you want to get start-sit advice from myself or Pierre just with your phone, go ahead, download the DraftLane app right now. And if you join for free, which just takes a couple minutes, and you apply promo code ENDGAME, we're going to give you 10 credits that you can use to ask start, sit, or any other kind of questions you like. Get your questions answered right away, any time of day. Download the Draft Lane app. Now, speaking of that Bills matchup, I love Dalton Kincaid this week. I might even like him more than Khalil Shakir, honestly. I talked about it already. The Falcons run the most single high 68% of the time of any defense in the NFL. You look at the Bills pass catchers versus single high, Dalton Kincaid leads them all with a 0.26 targets per route run. Now, Khalil Shakir is right behind him. I think you should feel great about Dalton Kincaid this week. This guy has been good most weeks this year. I think this is another week where he's going to be great against this Falcons defense that runs a ton of single high. And if you're looking for another tight end that I think is going to have a great week this week, had a great week 5, that is David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns. He gets to face his Steelers defense, which right now is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. And you look at it in week 5, the first game Dylan Gabriel started. David Njoku led all Browns pass catchers in targets, targets per route run, yards per route run, and had 1 of the 3 end zone targets. Njoku with Dylan Gabriel looks like he's going to be a beast again. And this week, against the Steelers defense that has not been great against tight ends, don't be surprised if he's once again one of the highest scoring tight ends. If you got Njoku, no, don't start him over those must-start obvious guys, but if you're streaming tight end and you got Njoku, yeah, put him in your lineup. And then finally, if you need a QB streamer this week, there's not a lot of good options out there outside the obvious Matthew Stafford, but look, I mean, that's pretty obvious against the Ravens. But let's go a little deeper here to a guy, Bryce Young. Hasn't been great this year, right? Been kind of up and down, but I really love him this week against his Cowboys defense because you look at it, Dallas Cowboys right now running the 2nd most zone coverage. 86% of the time they are in zone. And you look at Bryce Young this year against zone, his completion percentage, 63.8%, and his adjusted completion percentage, 77.8%. Contrast that to when he's playing man defense, 51.5% completion percentage and just a 69.2% adjusted completion percentage. For whatever reason, Bryce Young has been better against zone than man this year. And look, if that's not enough to get you excited about Bryce Young this week, which I understand there hasn't been a ton to get excited about for Bryce Young this year, how about this? The Cowboys allowing the most fantasy points to passers this year. This is a great spot for Bryce Young this week at home against the Cowboys offense that's probably going to force the Panthers to throw more than they want to, and a Cowboys defense getting decimated by quarterbacks. There you go, 10 stats you need to know for week 6 to help you make the right start-sit decisions for your fantasy lineups. But look, you need to know more than just this. If you missed any of our amazing week 6 videos, you can find them in our playlist right here.